Leafs trade talks are really starting to pick up as a brand new report from Friedman has dropped revealing Brad Treliving's trade plans ahead of this trade deadline. We're going to break down that report and discuss what it means going forward, as well as discuss another report that has dropped revealing a new Leafs target. Stay tuned for all that in this episode, but before we get into it, we just want to acknowledge that Paul Morris passed away at the age of 86. He was obviously the voice of Maple Leaf Gardens for a decade and played a big impact on a lot of people's lives, so we just want to acknowledge that before we get into this video.
Yeah, like Nick said, he was the voice of Maple Leaf Gardens for years and even sometime at the ACC when it first opened. And to this day, they still play recordings of him at the end of periods on Throwback Thursdays and obviously some games against Original Six teams. So our condolences go out to his family. And it's never easy to make a turn out of a topic like this, but we have some big news to get into today, Nick.
Yeah, condolences to him and his family. But we'll dive into the topic of the day now, which is surrounding the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, obviously, the Four Nations Cup is just around the corner. We're seeing Sidney Crosby, we're seeing Mitch Marner, and the jersey. All these different things are going on surrounding the Leafs. But Friedman dropped a new report. There's a bunch to get into today. So you can see this here on his 32 Thoughts podcast. Elliott says some players have been told that there's going to be action during the Four Nations break. There's a feeling around some teams, that players won't return. So this is going to be a very interesting next few weeks. We've been discussing on the channel a lot how this is almost like the trade deadline before the trade deadline. And then a new report has dropped from Friedman, which has sparked a debate among Leafs fans surrounding trading for two-time Stanley Cup champion. And the player we're going to be talking about today is, of course, Tarasenko. Acquiring a two-time Stanley Cup champion is always in the cards for most teams, and the fact that Tarasenko could be in play is very surprising. Now, he is having a very down season compared to his standards, but he's a veteran guy. Talking about a third liner, this could be a very interesting fit for the Leafs, and it has a lot of Leafs fans split here. But Darius, according to Friedman, Tarasenko seems to be available on the market.
Yeah, it could be a very interesting pickup for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And, we'll get to some Four Nation stuff in a bit as well, because Friedman also reported that there could be contract extensions signed during the Four Nations as well. And a lot could be picking up because a lot of the GMs are going to be off and watching these games. So it could get very interesting. But Vladimir Tarasenko, former Florida Panther last year, won the Stanley Cup. So I guess, at this point, Brad Treliving's just adding anyone he can from that team, obviously having three guys already this offseason that he added to the team. But you know what, having a down year, but he is playing with the Detroit Red Wings, who have been hot as of late, but early season, they were really struggling, right? Like this was not a good team whatsoever. They were not playing good hockey. So he is a guy that I think has turned it up a little bit. And again, he comes with that Stanley Cup pedigree. The only hang up to me would be, he's a winger. He's not a center. You know what your needs are. You probably need a center. I mean, I say probably. You need a center, another center, whether it's a second line or a third line center. And you know that you need another defenseman, whether it's a depth defenseman or a right shot defenseman that can play with Morgan Riley. Someone other than Hakanpää, who I don't believe is going to be playing the rest of this year, or at least, regularly. And obviously, Philippe Meyer, is he the answer? I'm not sure. Maybe you need a depth option there. But to get back to Tarasenko, it's the salary cap. It's the hit as well. If you're going to get a guy like this, you're going to have to retain salary, Detroit that is, and you're going to have to give up assets in that way. And do you want to do that for another winger? I know he comes with a Stanley Cup pedigree, which I think is something the Leafs needed to add more of, and they did this offseason. So I think that was great. Credit to Brad Treliving. But in terms of Tarasenko, I don't know if he pushes this team over the top. And, to spend assets to have retained salary in that way, I don't know if it makes too much sense.
Yeah, he is having a down year and obviously isn't a center, but could still play on that third line, replacing somebody on the Leafs because of maybe even Nick Robertson if he goes out in a separate trade. And you can see again here, he's 1 year removed from scoring 23 goals. And you think back to his 2021-2022 season with the Panthers when they won the Cup, he had a 34-goal season. So it's not like he's many years removed from having an elite season. He's been good as recent as really last year. And Toronto needs offense. While he's struggling this season, a fresh start could be what kickstarts the latter part of his career. He'll be able to fit throughout the lineup in the top 9 and be able to chip in on the power play as well, which is something that's going to be important as the Leafs continue to hopefully get their power play back to what it once was a couple years ago. Tarasenko also has familiarity with Craig Berube as he won his first Cup with the Leafs. And of course, Craig Berube is now the thing. However, we'll dive into now the issue with his contract. Would you want to commit 4.75 for this season and the next for a regressing player? Now, his cap hit is 4.7. Now, the bad thing is that, of course, that number being fairly high. But the good news is we know Brad Treliving likes to acquire players that can be a part of the future. He is under contract until 2026. And if you're the Leafs and you want to kind of shore up your third line winger spot, I mean, his projected depth chart at the moment, he's a second liner on the wings, I believe. So, I mean, they're at the point now where it's like, you could fit him in not only this year, but next season and really start to go and hopefully start to, create a bit of a veteran core here. However, he is 33 years old. He would be 34 going on 35 next season. but he's a very interesting player who has experience winning and is a very good goal scorer, even though this season, albeit with a fairly bad team in general in the Red Wings who have been hot as of late, he's having a bit of a down year. I think if you buy low on this guy, it would be the time, and I don't think he would cost too much, especially with the cap hit here, but you'd of course have to give up some assets in order to make the trade work.
Yeah, that's the thing. You would have to give up assets for the retained salary because there's no way you can take on that cap hit right at this point in time. So that would be the only hang up to me. And not just that one, I guess, but the fact that he is going to be pretty old, right? Like he's getting up there in age. He's older than Tavares. I don't know. I'm kind of reluctant to add more older guys to this team. You just added Pacioretty as well. Now, if he was on like league minimum or $1 million, I would be very open to adding this player. He has term. You could put him, like you mentioned, where Nick Robertson's playing because I would trust a guy like this who's won a Stanley Cup to produce more for you on your third line in that kind of sheltered role compared to what he played when they won the Stanley Cup in St. Louis with Craig Berube than Nick Robertson on that third line, right? So I think that that would be a better option in that way. But for this cap hit, even if Detroit were to retain 50%, it's still too much. I don't know where you're finding that money. You would have to trade Max Domi. I'd rather trade Max Domi in a different trade to get like a more effective player or a centerman in that way. So again, I think it's an interesting idea. Maybe if you got a couple teams involved, maybe if it was a bigger trade, maybe you're acquiring Justin Hall back. I'm just kidding, but they would not want to do that. But maybe if it's a bigger trade, they can make something happen. But I don't know if this is the answer. I think it's an interesting idea. He's played with for Craig Berube before. They want to Stanley Cup together. It would be a fun story, but it just doesn't make sense with the cap. I think the Leafs have other needs that they need to fill, and this is something that they can't be wasting their time on thinking about this because of the salary cap.
Yeah, it's interesting with the cap. I think I'm a bit higher on him than you are. I mean, he is still coming off of a really good season year before, a really good season as well. So he would be a big improvement over some of the guys that the Leafs have right now. But because of the cap hit, you'd have to, like you mentioned, unless there's some retained salary, you're going to have to trade Max Domi in a deal like this. And then if you're doing that, maybe you're probably better off. What's the big difference there between, of course, I mean, I would probably prefer, it depends. This season, I prefer Tarasenko. Domi's having a really bad season, but again, Domi's under contract for 3 more years. This is year 1 of a 3-year contract. So there's a bunch of different things that play into account here. And Friedman also dropped this, unless there's something going on, and this is surrounding Mitch Marner to pivot a little bit and kind of ties into them looking for a center. Unless there's something going on that I'm not seeing right now, which is always possible, I don't sense Mitch Marner is anywhere close to making a decision about free agency. I mean, which makes sense. I don't think they're going to extend him before the season is done. However, I am more optimistic now that the Leafs do extend him in the offseason, I guess when he's a free agent, than I was earlier because of the cap going up. But he also adds that Toronto has a list of centers and they're working through it to see what makes sense. And again, Tarasenko is a wing. He's not a center. You need to get a third line center. If they go out and they get a third line center and then maybe you can swing a deal for Tarasenko to help kind of shore up around the edges, sure, it might make some sense then if you can figure out a way to make the cap work. But otherwise, it seems like their number one priority is a center, which, I mean, it absolutely should be. They desperately need a third line center to replace Pontus Holmberg.
Yeah, it makes sense. It absolutely should be, whether it's a second line center or a third line center. They're going to make a move for a center. And I think it's most likely outcome. It's going to be a third line center, maybe Scott Lawton or something like that. We'll see if it's a bigger trade in that way, but they have to target a center. That makes sense from Friedman. And on top of it, the Mitch Marner stuff I think is interesting, right? Like, I don't think his mind has changed on where he's at. The salary cap going up has made it definitely more likely that he stays a Leaf past this season. But I think the Leafs are going to walk him to free agency. That is a fact. Like, there's no way that you can sign him before the end of this year's playoffs. Now, I don't mean they're walking him directly to free agency. You're going to still have a gap between the end of the playoffs, whether, it ends great or poorly for the Leafs. We'll see how that ends. But between, the playoffs ending for the Leafs and free agency July 1st, they'll have some time to figure out a contract. So they're not going to walk him directly to free agency, but there's no way you can sign him before the final game that the Leafs play this season.
Yeah, we'll keep you up to date with all the latest Leafs news. So make sure to hit the subscribe button and let us know down below what your thoughts are on Tarasenko as well as the Mitch Marner update. See you guys later.